trying to get the microphone on. But I can hear you better. That's kind of nice. You didn't know I was just reading your lips all these weeks. Last week we began with this little study on prayer. We've been talking about prayer the last few weeks. But prayer as a church, focused prayer for the future of the church. And last week I gave you some little just blank notebooks. I would call those to your attention. If you brought yours, I think that would be great for you to take some more notes today. But I want to review what I touched on last week, okay? And I recommended that you take one page and write something at the top of each page, and we're going to do that 4 times. And during the week, I actually took, Kathy's become the notebook passer-outer. So if anybody else needs one, we'll get you one. But during the week, I made sure I wrote these in my own prayer journal. I've been keeping a prayer journal for years, and I wrote these so that I could go over them and pray over them each day. So I want to review right now what we said last week. Excuse me if you already have it all in your brain and you got it, but let's just talk about, because I think it's an important part of getting into today. The first thing that I recommended you pray, this is more about you. It moves to us, but it starts with you. Lord, open my eyes. Lord, open my eyes. And I've gotten a couple of reports this week of God beginning to just show you things, speak to your hearts, open your eyes. But one of the reasons we need to start here in prayer is that we have to move from a me focus to an others focus in our prayer. Most of us start when we're first praying, and we're taught to pray. Pray about our own needs. Pray about the needs that are the closest to us. But I know so many people who said they're following Jesus and they have never moved from a me focus in prayer. When they read the Bible, it's always a me focus. What does it say? To me. And if you look at the ministry and the life of Jesus, you realize he was not living a me focus. He was living an others focus. And I think it's why it captivated so many people, as they realized that he wasn't focused on himself. When Paul was preaching in the book of Acts, he wasn't focused on himself. He was focused on the needs of the world around him. And so as we are starting to grow in our own prayer lives, it's great to just say, Lord, open my eyes. And it could be almost anything. It can be opening our eyes from not paying attention to suddenly being aware. Kathy, I've said this, I think, to you before, but I've delighted in this for so many years in our marriage. Kathy was basically an indoors person. Recreation was playing table games, that kind of thing. And when we traveled, she always typically had her head down on something, either reading or working on something. She loved to do puzzles and that kind of thing. These days, we go for walks early in the morning, and my wife is giving me a lesson on which bird sounds belong to which birds. And we both take particular delight, but she even more so than me, every time she hears a cardinal singing. And she starts looking up in the trees to see where the cardinal is. We've been around robins and other kinds of birds, but being here in country where there are cardinals, it's just like, whoa, this is amazing. But part of that comes from, Lord, open my eyes. There's so much more going on than is just about me. I remember, some of you know this, you're country music fans, and I remember when Toby Keith that had a song, and I want to talk about me. But we need to learn to talk about something besides me, and my hurts and my needs and my struggles and my wants and my wishes. And when we start to learn to move to another focus, it's a great beginning step in prayer. Second page, top of the page. I hope you'll take some time this week and just start writing down as you're getting kind of the Lord speaking to your heart. But the second page, Lord, what can be done? Why am I going from open my eyes to what can be done? Because when God begins to open our eyes to see the needs of the world around us, one of the things that it was James who wrote in his little letter when he said, faith without works is dead. It's not just enough to pray for people. Jesus said, why do you consider yourself righteous if you see someone in need and you walk right by them and basically just kind of yell out, be warmed and filled, God bless you, hope everything goes great, but you do nothing about their needs. And so one of the questions we should be asking is, so Lord, what do you want? What can be done about this particular need? I'll tell you a story about that before we close today. The third question is, top of another page, what does this tell me? As I'm being aware of needs around me, and there are needs around us literally all the time. So what is it saying? What's it saying to our heart? Awareness of a need gives me more to pray about. Now, it's not that prayer by itself is all we're going to do, but if we stop and pray, and Jesus was living, I heard this one time, it stayed with me for years and years and years. If you look at the ministry of Jesus carefully, you'll see that the way Jesus lived his ministry life was he went from prayer meeting to prayer meeting, and in between he did miracles. He was constantly praying. And his prayer gave him great insight. And so when I'm spending time in prayer, I start to notice needs around me. I can start praying for a friend or for a group of friends. And asking this kind of simple question to God, Lord, what are you saying here? What does this mean? Kathy and I frequently have these kinds of conversations in our marriage where we begin to see a need and it's like, well, Lord, what do you want us to do with this? And sometimes it's just pray and we're done. And sometimes it means we're to get involved in some way to step toward that need. But the answer is not always the same, and it becomes a part of our prayer life to know God in that way. And then the last one, last page is right on top of it. So what does this mean for Shawnee Heights? May not be anything. But my desire in talking to you about this over some weeks is I want to see, and I hope you are growing in your desire to see, a clear work of God that is drawing you together as a church, moving you together as a church to what God wants to do among you. We have a broken world all around us. We know that. So how do we respond to that? And by the way, if the Lord's getting his way, every church is going to have some unique answers. What does God want us to do? What's he saying to us as a church? Because God has, I'll call it a divine design for every individual church. He has a plan for your church. So today, picking up from that, that's where we were last week. I want to go back to some of the events in the Old Testament. My hope is that today you're going to do some spiritual stretching with me. Now, some of you guys, do you guys do stretch when you exercise or anything? Do you? That would have been, at my age, at your age, I would have been. I found out so much in recent years that if I'm not stretching today, I may not be able to stretch tomorrow. It's just life. So spiritual stretching is kind of like physical stretching. There's some clear health benefits to physical stretching. And what physical stretching is an opening step for us, or spiritual stretching, is that we find that God may have some loads He wants us to carry. We're told to bear each other's burdens, and that would fulfill the law of Christ. Well, a lot of us aren't ready to carry the burdens of someone else because, again, we need to learn how it is, what it looks like and feels like and is like to bear weight. We have, Kathy and I talk about weight-bearing exercise. That is important also in our lives, that we're learning that more in our older years than we did it when we were in our younger years. So here we go. Just like I was taught in the military, you're going to have some exercise. So ready? Begin. You ready? Let's start. I want to take you to Joshua chapter 2, verse 1. If I were to pinpoint one book in the Old Testament that I would say is probably my favorite book in the Old Testament, is Joshua. And there's so many reasons for it. But in Joshua chapter 2, he's just begun. Moses is dead. Joshua's taken on the leadership of the children of Israel. And they have just come out of the wilderness where they were for 40 years. All of the generation of adults who entered the wilderness when they were set free from Egypt, all of the generation of those who were adults and had responsibilities died in the wilderness. Do you know why? There were two who didn't. Their names were Joshua and Caleb. You know why they didn't die? Because when all of the rest of the adults in the wilderness were saying, no, we can't go into that land. Yes, it's a beautiful land, it's a good land, and yes, God said He would give it to us, but there's giants over there. It's too hard. We can't do that. And even though Joshua and Caleb were two of the 12 who went over to spy out the land, they were young men. And even though they said, no, God said He would do this for us. We're supposed to do what God says. The rest of the spies and then the rest of the people, we can't do it, we can't do it, we can't do it. And the Lord responded to that with, okay, you can't. So you're going to all die out here in the wilderness, and I'm going to raise up a generation of young people who will believe me when I say you can go take the land, and they will go take the land. Now, I don't know about you. That's partly an inspiring passage of Scripture when it says that. It's partly something that could scare you to death. That maybe we really should figure out what God is saying and that we should do those things. Joshua's been the leader a short time. Moses died. It's almost time to cross out of the wilderness into the promised land. And we pick it up in Joshua 2, verse 1. Joshua, the son of Nun, sent 2 men as spies secretly from Shittim, saying, go view the land, especially Jericho. So they went. Those 2 men went as spies. They entered the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and rested there. But it was told to the king of Jericho, saying, behold, men from the sons of Israel have come here tonight to spy out the land. As we are praying for God to open our eyes, individually and as a church, it can be common for the Lord to be at work in us, preparing things for us to see. Now, I will tell you that at our age, Kathy and I are discovering the joy of medical appointments. Sometimes I'm shocked at how many medical appointments we have to go to. And yet I have learned that waiting rooms are not places where you just sit and boringly browse through a 2-year-old issue of People magazine. Maybe it's a place to wake up spiritually and look across the room and say, Lord, what do you want me to see? This happened not too long ago. Kathy was having some testing done. I was going to be out in the waiting room waiting for her. And just before she was taken back there for her testing, sitting in the waiting room, I began to look and noticed a couple sitting a ways away from me. And I saw her with her phone, and literally, I think had some kind of a magnifying glass, and she had her phone in front of her, and she was holding it, and I knew she was almost blind. And I immediately zoned in. Lord, what are you saying? I see her. My heart of compassion goes out toward her. The man with her, I'm assuming it was her husband, he didn't seem to be giving her a whole lot of attention or whatever. Maybe she didn't want any. But I have adventures like that in waiting rooms all the time. Sometimes it allows an open door for me to speak to someone. By the way, I don't ever preach them a sermon. And guess what? The worst thing I could ever do in a waiting room at a doctor's office is say, hi, I'm Sam, I'm a pastor. Can I talk to you? They'll probably run out of the waiting room screaming, no! It's an adventure because everywhere we turn, we run into people in need, and sometimes they're more open just to talk about the hurts and the struggles of their own needs. And guess what? The reason we were in that waiting room is because Kathy has a type of cancer that's in complete remission right now, but we've been told all along it's probably coming back. We have to go for major tests every year. Bless her heart. My wife has got to have a spinal tap every year, and she's had many of them now. It's painful. It's hard. And every year it's a part of our lives. But when I look around and see the condition of people around us, I'm not so much concerned about us anymore. I begin to see that there are a lot of people who are hurting and in need. And that immediately lightens my load. And it's not because I'm glad they have greater loads. It's because I realize, yes, we have aches and pains. Yes, we have struggles. But the needs out there are far greater than we have much of the time. And we walk through life with Jesus, and they may not. Do you see? It's a part of life, beginning to notice the needs. But every time I see a need, I have to ask the question, Lord, what do you want to do here? Do you want me to say anything? I almost said something to the lady who was almost blind. And I didn't get anything from the Lord that indicated that I should. And I know better than to just run in my own strength and try to do it. It doesn't work that way. So Joshua sent out these 2 spies. And they were told to go some places, so they went places intentionally because they needed to discover some information to help Israel. And Joshua said, view the land, especially Jericho. That's what they were supposed to do. But when you're spying out the land, you go with an open mind and open eyes because you may step into situations you didn't know about when you got there. And you've got to say, what they say in military and other places, it's called situational awareness. You become aware of what's going on around you. And so they went ready to see things they didn't plan to see. By the way, he sent them from this place called Shittim, and it was just east of the Jordan River, and they were actually there for several months. That Hebrew city, the name Shittim means acacia trees. Now it's interesting, it's fascinating to me because it means it would have been right there with a grove, if you will, a group of trees all growing closely together. It's mostly a desert area in there. And acacia trees usually grew to about 20 feet high. They could be 2 feet thick in the trunk. And the wood was known for how dense it was. In other words, it was heavy, it was hard. And if you look carefully in the Old Testament, you'll see that the tabernacle, the framework of the tabernacle was made out of acacia wood. If you look carefully, you'll see that the Ark of the Covenant was framed in acacia wood. It was a very important part, a building block, if you will, for them. And this was a grove of acacia trees, which is probably the cash crop that kept this city going. So they just named it Acacia or Shittim, which is what it was in Hebrew. And it was there that they waited until the Lord said, go into the land. They had been in this place a while. How many of you remember the story in the Old Testament of a guy named Balaam who kept refusing to listen to God, and finally the only way God could get through to him was he was trying to ride his donkey through a narrow place in a canyon, just a very, very narrow place between rocks, and suddenly the donkey could see, but Balaam was not seeing, that there was an angel of God standing in that place. And Balaam gets his thing out to start beating the donkey, and the donkey turns around and talks to Balaam. You remember that? There's some really interesting stories in your Old Testament. This is where Israel was at the time of Balaam. And the king of that land, Balak, had hired Balaam to come and curse Israel, but of course he couldn't, because the Lord said, you can't do that. And yet Balaam, while he was there, said, well, God's not letting me curse them, but King Balak, just so I can do something for you, because you're paying me a whole lot of money, you're doing a consultant fee for me to help you with this. Let me tell you that this people is very prone, the men of this land are very prone to sexual temptation, and if you'll send all of your young women and girls over there to entice them, guess what? It will be just as bad as me cursing them. So King Balak did that. And it was horrible. Immorality, it was like overnight. Immorality is like a raging fire over the people of Israel. And as a result, the Lord sent a plague against Israel and wiped out 24,000 people. That was all while they were at Shittim. But Moses is dead now, and Joshua is leading, and it's almost time for them to cross the river into the land. And Joshua sends the 2 spies over to spy out Jericho. By the way, there are life lessons for this all the way through, for groups of people and individuals. For the church, you can imagine what it was like for the morale of the nation. How many homes were literally turned upside down in that vast sweeping fire of immorality? And then when God sent the plague of judgment and all of those who died, how much pain was that among the children of Israel? You can imagine. It was terrible. But God still had something miraculous planned in their near future. They were right on the border of the promised land. Now guess what? Somebody can spend a day or two around here talking to people, getting to know them, and they would say, if they listen to stories and hear the background, they'll say, you know what? Maybe this is kind of a hard time for Shawnee Heights Baptist Church. Maybe this is a time when the church is kind of struggling. Maybe this is a time when some people are saying, is God done with us? And the answer that I would give you to that is, if God can work on Israel and through Israel right after what had been happening at Shittim, He can work through anybody who will seek Him, any church that will seek Him. It may be that the church has been going through trials and the morale may be low. And maybe some of you who used to walk with great faith have wondered, is God finished with us? And the answer is no. No. We serve a God who knows us, and He sees everything. By the way, when we feel desperately weak, we're ready to be strong in faith. Never forget what Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He said, and He, that's the Lord, has said to me, because Paul was going through these trials, praying, Lord, would you please remove this problem from me, this thorn in the flesh? And the Lord said, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected where? It means it's made mature. Power is made mature where? In weakness. Everybody say, in weakness. Power is made mature in weakness. So Paul goes on and he says, most gladly, therefore, I would rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in distresses, in persecutions, in difficulties, in behalf of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So I'll tell you the answer. Somebody says, how's Shawnee Heights doing? I would answer truthfully. I'd say, you know what? We're trying to find a pastor. It's been a discouraging time for us. But our future is as bright as the promises of God. And even the weakness that we feel right now is the seedbed for Him to show His strength to our church for the future. When I'm weak, I'm strong. And over in Romans, Paul again wrote, and he said in Romans 13, do this, knowing that the time, that it is already the hour for you to awaken from sleep. For now salvation is nearer to us than when we first believed. The night is almost gone and the day is near. Therefore, let's rid ourselves of the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Guys, I can't tell you the number of times that God has moved over the centuries when everyone felt there is no hope. Everything is coming apart. We don't know what we're going to do. It seems like, where is faith going? What's happening to us? And a little group of people began to pray and cry out to God and say, Lord, please help us. In New York City many years ago, on Fulton Street, there was a business. Somebody had opened their doors, and in fact, I think the room was empty. And somebody said, I'm going to start going into that place. It was available to them. I'm going to start going into that place at noon every day. And I'm going to pray for God to revive us in this city. Somebody found out they were doing it. Soon there were 2 of them, and then 3, and then 4. And then 10 and 15 and 25 and 50, and soon the crowd of people coming into that room to pray at noon every day and cry out to God to move in their city was so great that the room wouldn't hold them anymore. If you felt a little discouraged, it's time to pray. It was a discouraging time in the life of Israel. But Joshua knew God had a purpose for them. Now, what's really crazy is the two spies go into Jericho, just like Joshua said. And who is the one who met them and took care of them, basically welcomed them, and then sheltered them, and then hid them from the king? It was a prostitute. Don't try to paint a nice picture on that. She was a prostitute. She was a prostitute on whom God was at work, and she had the audacity to believe that Israel served a big, great God. I'll tell you, one of the signs of God moving is when you begin to see that the people who are being stirred and starting to be changed are the ones that many people wrote them off and said, there's no hope for this person. By the way, I love it. I told you at the beginning, we need to pray and move our prayer from me to others. Rahab had an others focus. So in Joshua 2, 9 to 11, she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us. Here they were back there saying, oh, woe is us, things are bad, look what happened, look what we did, the great sin, the plague that God sent, what's going to happen? And she said, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have despaired because of you. For we have heard, not about you, but how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, close to where they were now, to Sihon and Og, who were both giants, and they were considered unconquerable. You utterly destroyed them. And the spies said, Rahab said to the spies, when we heard these reports, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in anyone any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth below. Yes, Israel had been disciplined because of their immorality. And yes, their morale was low. But God was on their side. Why? Because they were perfect? No. Because when God had invited them to be on His side, they said yes. Yes, I'll be on your side, Lord. Yes, Lord, I will be on your side, whatever that means. Have you accepted that invitation to be on the Lord's side? Has that happened in Shawnee Heights, where your thoughts are, you know what, we want to be on God's side. We don't know fully what it means, but we want to be on God's side in this community. By the way, the moment you start saying yes to God, you know, He knows, and the enemy knows. The enemy knows. But guess what? Any group of people that start saying yes to God, will be surprised at the number of people. They have no idea how they knew, but they knew. What would it be like if you had new people walking in every week saying, we don't know what it means, but we've just heard that God is among you. And we want to be a part of this. Some years back, we had a medical team working in a third world country. And my job that day was kind of like a greeter, just greeting people who were coming. They'd bring all kinds of situations. Sometimes parents would bring a very sick child in their arms. And we had doctors and nurses, at least one or two doctors and some nurses and people in there working, doing everything they could in this hot little house in this community. And soon a man showed up with his little child. And we began to talk and find out where did they come from. And that neighborhood was really close to the harbor in this port city. And there had to be, I don't know, a mile or two or three of water across that harbor. And somehow, all the way across on the other side of the harbor, back on the land on the other side of the harbor, this man had heard that there was help for his child. And he put that child in some kind of a small boat and made his way across that harbor to land on the shore there and walk a few blocks to find our medical team. And when I heard that story, I thought, how did he know? Who told him? And the answer is, I'm not sure we'll ever know. Here's what I can tell you. When God starts working, things will happen that you won't have answers to. Things will happen that you won't have answers to. You'll just be looking around saying, must have been God. We didn't do that. One of my favorite little stories I heard years ago, Kathy and I talk about it for some times, is the little boy who brought his lunch and Jesus had been teaching, and he was kind of up close. He wanted to hear what Jesus was saying or whatever, and the time was going along, and the disciples were getting concerned. He said, Lord, won't you send the people away to get some food? They're going to be hungry, and you know that there were 5,000 of them, men plus 5,000 men plus women and children. And Jesus said, you give them something to eat. And they're kind of like, what? Jesus said, how much food do you have? Said, well, there's a little boy over here in his lunch. He's got 5 little loaves of bread and a couple of pieces of fish. That's what we can find. And Jesus said, bring them to me. And whoever I heard tell this story described the little boy. He's watching, and they said, can we take your lunch? And he's kind of like, yeah, because he knew Jesus, the master up there, wanted the food. So he took it. And he's sitting next to one of his little friends, and they're watching. The disciple walks up with the basket of his lunch and hands it to Jesus, and Jesus begins to pray up there. He doesn't know exactly what's going on. He starts distributing food. And the little boy turns to his friend and says, he took my lunch. That's my lunch. He got my lunch. And then he starts watching as more and more baskets of food are being moved out among the people, and everybody's getting something to eat. He looks at his friend with his eyes big as saucers and says, that's not my lunch. When a church says, God, we want you to do whatever you want to do among us, and he starts doing it, you'll be amazed, not by some man, not by some celebrity, by the power of God. And the people in the days of Joshua were going to learn to open their eyes and see what God was doing. That's what we're praying for. Lord, move. Move in our church. Move in our hearts. Open my eyes to see what you are doing. Some of you know that that was the whole story behind Experiencing God that Henry Blackaby wrote years ago about their work up in Canada. And he said the big problem is we all want to go make God's work happen. And he says, instead, open your eyes to see where God is work and then say, Lord, how can we join you in doing what you are doing? And so it was about time for Israel to march, to leave Shittim and start working their way down to cross the Jordan River. God was clearly at work before them because God spoke to them about that. The spies came back with a report from the land. And so they were going to start moving. From then on, it would be easy, right? No. You see, God is the God of the impossible. And one of the ways He keeps training us is He keeps throwing us in front of situations like Jesus did to the disciples. You give them something to eat. It's not easy. So as a church starts to say, God, move among us. Do the work you want to do among us. He's the God of the impossible. And it's going to cause you to pray even more. It won't be easy. But when you take God at His word and take the first step and walk by faith and not by sight, oh my. This happens in Topeka, Kansas. It was about 3.5 years ago that Luke, who was a new man in our church with his family, we'd met them. I'd talked some with Luke and his wife, Kate, and I found out they weren't in any kind of a home group, and I was leading a group, and I said, hey, why don't you come to our group? And Kate couldn't come with the little boys one night. They were doing something else, but Luke said, I want to come. And so he came. He rode up on his motorcycle. It was just a handful of us there that night, and it happened to be in my home. And we got through with the group. Other people left. There was just really only Kathy and me and one lady and Luke, and it was the weirdest group we probably ever had, except that night after the lady left, Kathy went about doing some other things. Luke said, do you have time for me to talk to you? And I said, sure. So standing in my kitchen, he said, I was visiting some friends in another place in Kansas, and I had some time, and they said, hey, why don't you go with us on Saturday and help us build some beds, because we're going to build beds and take them to meet the needs of kids in our town that don't have a bed. And he said, I went and I helped them build beds, and it really just kind of spoke to my heart. And he said, then I was later in another part of Kansas and found out they did something similar, and I think he went and helped them too. And he said, I've begun to think that maybe God wants us to start this because it's something you can start local chapters. It's called Sleep in Heavenly Peace. You can start local chapters in your own town or whatever. And he looked at me, and seriously, he said, do you think I'm crazy? And I don't know why. I really don't. I've told people lots of times, I feel like that God has more times than I can think. It's like He gave me front row seats at the 50-yard line to watch what He does. And I never look at it and say, look what I did. It's like, goodness gracious, Lord, you just let me watch what you did. So I said to Luke, no, I said, it sounds a lot like God. He said, well, do you think there's a need? I said, I don't know, but there's some people in our group that know that kind of thing, and they could probably help you with that and answer that question. And he said, well, what will we do? He said, and we talked about it. I said, well, let's talk to the group about it and see what they think. The next week or two, whatever, he mentioned it to the group, and the group kind of got excited. They never heard of it. The theme of Sleep in Heavenly Peace is no kid sleeps on the floor in our town. And Luke was still asking the group, do you think there's really a need of this in Topeka, Kansas? A few weeks later, on a cold November morning. Luke and Kate live out on a farm out by Auburn and really out by Dover, and they have an outbuilding that had a lot of space and whatever. And our group met there on a Saturday morning and did the first build of beds in Topeka, Kansas for Sleep in Heavenly Peace. I think they built 7 that day. It was something like that. It was a small number. And I told you, it seems like the experience of my life is often just to get to sit on the sidelines and watch. Because the morning that they were building beds, I was with Kathy in KU Medical Center in Kansas City, where she had just had a stem cell transplant and was going to be in the hospital. She was getting over that. And they started sending pictures and celebrating what God had done, where they built a handful of beds. Not long after, Luke met a guy named Jim who had a similar vision. They started doing a little more, and doors began to open, and more doors opened. And I laugh all the time at Luke. We happen to still be in a group with Luke and Kate, and I laugh all the time, and I say, yeah, I remember that day. Your big question was, do you think I'm crazy? I asked them Tuesday night after group, I said, hey, how many beds have you done so far in Topeka, Kansas, where you weren't sure there was even a need for this? And he said, right now we're at 750 or 760 beds of kids who were sleeping on the floor in Topeka, Kansas. And now they can sleep on a bed at night. And those beds have been provided to those families free of charge. Kathy and I have delivered a bunch of beds. We've seen stuff that's just wild. You know why it happened? It happened because Luke was opening his eyes to see what he was doing, God was doing. And Luke saw this as possibly a place to see if God was at work, and he said, how can we join you? And bit by bit, in their case, bed by bed, lives are being touched by the love of Jesus and changed. That's why I'm passionate to preach to you about faith. And I'm going to close that off here. That's only the first half of the sermon, by the way. I told Jeff Friday or yesterday, I said, I'm probably going to split this one in half, and that's what's going to happen here. Because I want to give you a dose of starting to see with the eyes of faith. Church, the God we say we serve is the God of the impossible. He loves your neighbors more than you can imagine. He cares more about the hurts that are all around you than you can imagine. And if you begin to open your lives up and say, okay, Lord, that's what we want. That's what we want. We want you to work in us, in our church, in our city. Oh my, what He will do. Thank you, Lord, that you called us to live out the loving, serving life of Jesus in our generation. Open our eyes, please. As we seek you for wisdom and insight, help us not to be discouraged in the moment where we are, but to be full of faith and hope about the moments you have in front of us. And speak to us as we pray this week. In Jesus' name, Amen.